A very happy new year and a warm welcome to Hyde Park this year, year 2020. A brand new year, a brand new decade. And Sri Lanka looks ahead for, of course, prosperity in economic development and all other spheres. To discuss the way forward for the country, the roadmap for economic development, and what Sri Lanka should set our eyes upon during this year, we have invited to our studios an expert, a veteran economist, a gentleman who has seen the development of regulation to and also financial aspects of the country as the head of the governor one time. May I warmly welcome to our studios former Central Bank Governor, Mr. Ajith Nivard Cabraal, now the senior advisor to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much for having me this evening. I'm delighted to be here.
Certainly, and we wanted to talk about the policies for this year, but you're also the author of an expose, the mother of all cover-ups. I think this is something that I like to talk about.
Great.
When you say mother of all cover-ups, who is responsible? Who is the mastermind behind this
I have shown in that book, Indeewari, the bond scam happened on the 27th of February 2015. But for 5 years, it was covered up with various ruses.
Right.
There was first a 3-member team to inquire, then there was a COPE committee, another COPE committee, then a board commission, then a forensic audit, all of which were designed to cover this up, and they have stretched that for 5 years. And that, to my mind, is a great achievement from the point of view of the scammers, and the designer behind that, to my mind, is the former Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe.
Well, we'll talk more about that. And thank you for giving me this book. I definitely enjoyed reading this. When you say an expose, it's going to be interesting how you look at it. But let's talk about 2020. This has been a year that we Sri Lankans have been looking forward to see what 2020 would be, regardless of who the president will be, regardless of who's in power. We've had a lot of dreams and aspirations for a better country. In your view, where do you see Sri Lanka in 2020?
Let me very briefly tell you, way back in 2015 in January, when the central bank put out what was called the roadmap, which I think on Monday the new governor is going to enunciate. In that, in 2015, we enunciated an economy that was going to be a $145 billion economy by the time 2020 was reached. Today we are nowhere near that, but we are not going to be dissatisfied with that and then cry about that. So we need to now take steps to move towards that line. And had we gone in the same momentum that we had in 2014, we would have probably have reached that today. But yet, we have certain issues to deal with. We have to tweak certain areas so that we can get the economy back on track. And once we do that, I know we could be able to have a much better and faster growth, and that's what we need to aspire for. So going forward in 2020, I think we need to reach out for a much higher growth than what we had enjoyed or what we had suffered in 2019. We need to change that completely. We need to get our macro fundamentals into shape. When I say macro fundamentals, our interest rates have to come down. Our rupee has to be stronger and more stable. We have to see that there is a lot more investment coming into the country. We have to see that the businesses are able to have a momentum so that there is a lot more money in circulation as far as the businesses are concerned. Now, if we get those things right, then we'll get the rest of it right. We'll get our debt to come down. We'll get our GDP to rise. We'll get people seeing the development in Sri Lanka, and then they will want to come to Sri Lanka and start investing. All those things are based on the mind. You've got to see that the optimism is created in a country. So in economics, why do markets go up in one day when there's a change of government? It is because of the feelings that they have, that it may be doing better. Now that kind of feeling doesn't last forever. So we got to make use of that, and we got to make sure that there are some results on the ground which shows that their optimism is actually warranted. And once we do that, you will find that the country will start moving up, and then we get into what is known as a virtuous cycle. Today we are in a vicious cycle where interest rates are high, no investment is coming in, and that is leading to job losses, that is leading to companies getting into trouble, that is leading to the banks having non-performing loans. So that cycle has to be broken. Then shifted towards the new virtuous cycle. And once you move into that, you find that that itself feeds the optimism. Then people begin to say, okay, this is good. We can do more business. Let's invest. Let's go and employ more people. That feeling has to be created with the work that the government does, as well as what the private sector sees as being done. So that's a challenge that we have. It's not an easy challenge, but it's also not a very difficult challenge either. If we get our basics right and we start moving in the right direction, and those trends are visible to people, you will find that people will respond.
I think you've summed up what how optimistic we can be, what the challenges we have, the potential we have, and all that in just a few minutes. Mr. Cabraal, now you said if we get these things right, are we on track? Are we on
yes,
track?
We are on track.
Are we getting the right policies? It has been more than a month now since the government, since the new president was elected. Of course, we're looking at a general election ahead. But are we doing the right things in terms of regulation and policy?
When I came on this program before the elections, you asked me, or your people asked me, what needs to be done? And if you remember, I said, first of all, we have to cut the taxes. We have to give a boost to the private sector. They must think, okay, we are on the right track. We are not going to be saddled with more and more taxes, and we are taken off from those shackles.
Yes.
We did that. I think lots of people didn't think that this government would have the courage to do that, because there were many people who were detractors and who had various doomsday stories. But the government had the courage to release the private sector from all these shackles that they were driven into. And second, they said, we will release the private sector who are in trouble from their troubles, so that they can concentrate on the business. If you notice, there are lots of people whose names are in the crib. Their companies are doing badly, so they are not able to perform with their banks. Banks are behind them. Banks are having non-performing loans. So all these actually are inhibitions to business. So you need to release them from that too. Now those two initiatives of the government, of the new government, are bold, and at the same time they are long-term driven. So now what we have done is we have given a freedom for businesses to move forward, even though the government is taking a hit on its revenues, but there are different ways of managing that, and I will talk about that when we have time. But at the same time, the first step has to be done so that we get the interest back into the economy and the optimism back into the people. Once you do that, of course, it will also mean that people will have to pay less for some of their goods and services, which also helps them to consume more. So that again drives another new cycle where people will then have more money to spend and the businesses will do even better. So now that kind of a cycle has to be created with some bold moves. So we believe that by doing that, we will be able to move to a higher growth trajectory, which is very important for a country like ours, which will create more new jobs, more money in the hands of people, and they in turn will go and spend more money. All that will mean that new investment will come into the country as well. We need to have that.
Yes, but when we talk about higher economic growth, it doesn't seem that the government has a lot of faith in the kind of economic growth that we can achieve given the kind of policies that you're putting in place. We say 4.5% growth this year, but the region, there are countries that are seeing massive growth targets. During your time as central bank governor, I remember we had an amazing growth in the country, but growth was subdued. Last year's growth expectations are below potential, and we're expecting 4.5 in 2020 and 6.5% in the years beyond. Can't we see anything beyond?
Absolutely good question. I think 4.5% was the growth target that the government as well as the people had and the central bank had before these initiatives were put in place by the new government. These were the numbers that IMF has also agreed with this government, the previous government rather, and those numbers are still being articulated. In my view, those numbers are not valid anymore, because the fact that new initiatives have been taken to reduce taxes, and that money is going to be now with the private sector, and that's a huge amount of money that they will have. So they will reinvest that money, about $1.5 or 2% of GDP is now going to be not paid to the government but retained within the private sector, because they're not paying it as taxes.
Right.
So once you have that, they will invest it. They will leverage that, they will invest that, and that means more economic activity. Then secondly, when these things happen in Indeewari, what normally happens is new investment also comes into a country. When new investment comes in, like what happened in the years 2009 to 2014, the interest rates also start dropping, because there's more confidence in the economy and more money is coming into the country. So interest rates have a tendency to drop at that time. When the interest rates come down, the risk of businesses also comes down dramatically. And when that happens, you find that people are able to invest more, and that creates that virtuous cycle that I mentioned. So I believe when this number of 4.5% was brought back and articulated,
it was just during the monetary policy review
statement. The central bank, in my view, had not taken into consideration the changes of policy, and they were merely talking about the previous numbers, and they would have probably have not really considered the impact of these initiatives that were put in by the new government. When that happens, I think we can move towards 6.5% growth, and that is important. Yes, this year, because if we have that, it will mean that we have also laid the foundation for the growth for the future. Actually, we have advantage this year, because the base of 2019 is a low base. When you have 2.5% growth, naturally the base is a low base, because the growth has been pretty low, as you quite rightly mentioned, and that means that the space as well as the capacity of the economy had not been utilized very well in the previous year. So if you start utilizing the capacity itself, that is enough for you to have additional growth yourself. So I think these factors have to be taken into consideration by the central bank, by the policymakers, and I will also articulate that in the internal meetings as well, because I think we need to have a new number as our target. So that we set the kind of confidence you say that the investors look forward to. I mean, who is the person who will go to a country which says we have 3%, 4% growth when the rest of the region is growing at 6%? So we need to understand that we have to now change our focus. We have to get additional momentum. And if we do that, I think we are going to be on the right track.
We're talking about the roadmap. This has always been a massive event at the beginning of the year, any year, where the central bank talks about the roadmap for the economy, financial institutions, and the rest of the country. How would you think we should look at this? How do you think we should set the roadmap for 2020?
As you quite rightly mentioned, Indeewari, the roadmap is an important piece of information for the rest of the public to know as to where the country is going as far as its economic policies are concerned and what the targets are. Because once you have that, the others also can then prepare their own plans, their own corporate plans to fit in with that. Now, the central bank has a responsibility to do that, and I think I started it at the time I became the governor from 2006 onwards, and that was looked forward to by the business sector, because they felt, okay, we need to know what the central bank is saying, about the government is saying, and then we can again make our own plans in relation to that. So I think them following that is an important part, and in so doing they got to be careful that they don't pitch it too high or pitch it too low. The expectations must be realistic, and when the central bank does that in a professional manner, the business sectors will get that feeling as well as that direction. So I think this time round is an important event, because the central bank will have to set these targets very carefully. If the central bank sets targets which are too low, it would mean that people will think there's no need to strive, and that would mean that you would have lesser interest in our economy, particularly from outside. So if you set it too high, people will think, no, it's not achievable, and then it's not going to work. But because we are having a low base, I think a 6.5% growth is possible. 6% growth is, I think, would be the right number to strive for. And then you need to prepare your policies for that. because we have the capacity in our country. The tourism will bounce back. We will see the new policies of the president as well as the government kicking in. That we would see new infrastructure development projects coming in, and with that we'll probably see the growth momentum coming back into the country.
Right, I think we'd like to talk more on that, and if the central bank will keep up to its policy direction, and I'd like to talk about this too.
I like to do that too.
The mother of all cover-ups. After a short break here at Hyde Park, we're talking to the former central bank governor and now senior advisor to the Prime Minister, Mr. Ajith Nivard Cabraal. You're joining us here at Hyde Park. Mr. Cabraal, as I said, we'll talk about your expose, the great bond scam cover-up and the mother of all cover-ups. Why mother of all cover-ups? Because we've seen a lot of investigation into this after the bond scam was exposed. The former governor of the central bank is still at large. Now the present government, it has been more than a month since the government came into power, but that was not what the government said back in the day. So with all that, and we see that there is not much work done in this regard. Did you have to write a book to remind the government that a certain action had to be taken, or is work happening?
This book took me 1 year to write. It's a book of 326 pages, A4 size. And it also took me 1 year to conceptualize as to how I should write it. So it was not only to prompt the government to doing something. I didn't know which government is going to be there either. But I wanted to document what was taking place in our country, which many people didn't interpret, in my view, in the way that they should have. You see, what happened in Sri Lanka was, there was a huge scam, a huge robbery. And that never got investigated properly. What happened initially was that the Prime Minister appointed a set of lawyers.
Very quickly, I'd like to say something, Mr. Cabraal. Now, this book, we're trying to, something that draws my attention. Your note, 1 trillion here. Are you trying to talk about the loss?
The loss, in my view, can add up to 1 trillion. And that's why I thought I will have that in the cover so that people know.
Very interesting graphic.
I have to give credit to the fantastic graphic designers. I can't take credit for it. Well, I must say I had some ideas about that, but they did it in a masterly way, and I'm very grateful to them for that. What I want to say is, normally if there was a scam of this nature, let's say it happened here, what would you have done? You would have gone to the police and said, we have a scam of this nature, please investigate. Fraud Bureau would have come, they would have questioned people, they would have looked at the evidence, and then they would have started prosecuting. But here in Sri Lanka, the government was able to continuously sidestep the issue. And I say that with responsibility, and I call it the pickpocket theory, where they were able to distract people by having new gimmicks all the time. So what did they do? They first had a committee of three people to look into the scam. Then everyone knew that nothing is going to happen with that.
When you say the commission deftly sidestepped the quantification of the losses caused by the bond scam, I haven't read your exposé.
The commission report, the much expected commission report, which I have very clearly said in my book, is also a part of this entire cover-up scam that was never meant to go and catch the actual culprits. This was all part of this whole huge cover-up scheme. So this commission, the COPE reports, COPE actually did a genuine job as far as they were concerned. But you don't go to COPE in order to find the thief. And what is COPE? COPE is a political body. A political body which has the politician of their own party now being on the mat. They would have wanted to sidestep that as much as possible. So that is what happened. So the COPE committees, the Bonds Commission, now the forensic audit are all attempts to shift the real accountability process. And these actually have not brought the culprits to book. They're just going on and on and on with one after another. What is the use of all that? You got to have a proper investigation by the law enforcement authorities, and then the law enforcement authorities must say who is at fault, and then once that is done, the Attorney General's Department will say how we can file charges, and that's the process that you have to take. These are political processes which have been done in such a way that you buy time. And the Prime Minister was able to stay in his seat for 5 years after being the mastermind for this scam. And that's what I'm very, very consciously putting out for people to understand that. Because more than the scam itself, the fact that they were able to cover this up and not have anyone charged properly, especially those who have to be charged, for 5 years is, to my mind, a great victory for the scammers, but a great defeat as far as the rest of the law-abiding people of this country are concerned.
But what is the sentiment of the present regime, present law enforcement authorities? Because now, yes, 5 years we've overlooked this, but now it's the time to take action.
I think we need to immediately take action, but they need to have guidance too, Indeewari. You see, they have all been now lulled into some kind of a bond scam fatigue, in my view. I've used that word as well, because they have created this fatigue where people say nothing is happening, nothing is happening. So people get that into their own minds as well. So I wanted to break that. Tell people, look, this now has to get into a shape where there is clarity as to what the government should do. And to my mind, the best thing that the government can do is to have a top-class investigator, a policeman who is qualified, who can understand this, put in charge of this investigation. They investigate. Now there's lots of evidence that has cropped up here and there, but nothing has been put together in a cohesive manner. Put it together. And this book, I think, will guide them. It will give them clues as to where to look, because I have also studied this very carefully. You
launched this yesterday. Have you handed it over to relevant authorities?
I have done that. I have given a copy to the President, I have given a copy to the Prime Minister, and I thought that was my duty to do that. I did that actually before the book was launched, so that they have a additional reading. And I actually wanted to do that, Indeewari, because I think the people also need to have faith that this process is not dead. A lot of people...
when you say justice must not only be done, but must also be seen to be done, this is something you have an article, you have some notes written about this, so I think you may have mentioned this to the authorities when you handed over the book.
Absolutely, because as you know, even the Bond Commission, some of the people who were involved in the Bond Commission were actually should not have been involved because of their own involvements with political parties as well as other conflicts of interest. So when you have that kind of a situation, you find that overall the process is damaged. So let's forget about all these processes that are damaged. Do a plain and simple inquiry, and with the inquiry certain information will come out. And I also mentioned that in my presentation yesterday, I mentioned as to how lots of times when they get close to a particular situation, they pull back. They pull back all the time when they get close, and then they shift the focus onto something different. Bank of Ceylon funded the primary dealer with 10 billion, but they never asked Bank of Ceylon, who asked you to give the 10 billion? 10 billion is not easy sum to get from someone. But that inquiry stopped there. Nobody searched for it. Then they said there was telephone calls done between some of the primary dealers and ministers. But nobody went beyond that, because those names, those abbreviations were somewhat embarrassing. So they didn't go further. Some people were handled with kid clubs, very softly. Even the errant governor, he got an assurance, for his lawyers got an assurance on his behalf that he'll be treated very gently. That's how he came and faced the Bond Commission. Have you ever heard of anyone saying, I want to be treated nicely when I go to the police station, and therefore some questions must be asked in a polite way? They must have the right to question deeply and then get at the bottom of the problem as to what happened. So there were many situations of that nature.
Is there also a serious look at setting central bank regulation in terms of looking at it and revisiting regulation in order to make sure that none of this resurfaces?
See, on the day of the scam, as the Prime Minister himself admitted in Parliament, he had insisted that the system be changed. Now, how can a system that has lasted for 18 years, which was the system that was handling the country's largest transaction in that they were issuing treasury bills and treasury bonds, be changed at the whim and fancy of a politician? Now that was done, and he admitted to that. Now once that was done, that system was being carried in our country's premier institution for 29 months without change, back again to the old system, because they wanted to show as if that was a bad system that was changed. It was not. The interest rates went up and up and up, and one of the reasons that this country went into a spiral as far as the interest rates were concerned was the first time that they started this racket. After that, when the change occurred, as soon as it occurred, 29 months later, all monetary boards are responsible for that. They made that happen, and they didn't pull it back because they wanted to make sure that the cover-up was maintained, and that nobody knew that this old method was the wrong method, that the old method, when I say one that they changed and got into that they didn't want to change that mainly because they didn't want to show that that was the bad method. Then they waited, hopefully till it died down, and then they changed it. Now all this reeks of corruption. So someone has to investigate that, put these offences into proper boxes, and then deal with it. And I think that's where we need to go. We need to put this behind us after we have had a proper investigation, not these bogus investigations that were done in the last 5 years under the guidance of the former Prime Minister. All these were done under his guidance.
And I think people of this country rely on the present regime to look into this matter and to bring to book the culprits, and I think we should take a short break. We'll return to speak more with Mr. Ajith Nivard Cabraal after this. Joining us at Hyde Park. We've been talking about the central bank bond scam and regulation that is needed. Something else I'd also like to talk about is failed financial institutions, Mr. Cabraal. I know there were regulations brought to streamline these and to bring financial institutions under the purview of the central bank. But in recent times, we did see financial institutions that were registered and were under the purview of the central bank failing. And this misleads depositors and the people of this nation who have nowhere to look now. So how do you think we should look at this? A former central bank governor, I think we need to talk about this.
A very valid question, and I think we need to come to grips with this situation very, very clearly. You know, the way the financial system works is that the system itself must be stable. For the system to be stable, the macro fundamentals also must be stable. If the people are unable to pay back their loans, you will generally find that the finance companies as well as the banks will struggle because their overall performing loans are not able to carry the non-performing loans. When I say that, what it means is the performing loans, the people who are paying the interest, will have to also suffer as a result of the bad loans that are now increasing. Now, during the last 4 or 5 years, we saw that the financial institutions were under tremendous stress because of the fact that lots of the businesses were on a downturn and some of them were unable to pay. The interest rates were also high, so which makes it even more difficult for them to make their payments. So we had that situation for a pretty long time, about 3 or 4 years now. As a result, the stresses that emanated from that situation had caused some amount of strain in the finance companies as well. Now when that happens, what needs to be done is for the regulator to also support them, not with reduced regulatory aspects, but to also ensure that certain institutions that are having difficulties are supported in a sense so that they can do their businesses better. Now, if you remember, somewhere in 2009, under my time when I was governor, we set up what is known as a Deposit Insurance and Liquidity Support Fund.
Right.
The purpose of doing that, and we started off with 1 billion rupees at that time. Today it has a balance of about 65 billion. Now what the purpose of that was to give support to institutions that have difficulties to resurrect themselves, to revive themselves. Because that is very important, because all businesses do go through difficult times. So when financial institutions go through difficult times, the banks have the ability to draw from the central bank and have some support in times of difficulty. That's why when during my time one of the banks had some difficulties, we were able to prop it up. We were put that under the guidance of another bank. We stood behind them, we gave confidence, and then that was nursed back into health within just 1 year. That's one of the fastest ever turnarounds that was experienced in the world. Now, that kind of situation we couldn't do with finance companies because the central bank did not have the ability to come in and fund at a time when funds were needed. That is exactly why at that time we set up this insurance fund so that that could come into the rescue of situations before the financial institutions went into difficulty. Now, I think the central bank had the responsibility to use that fund at the time when some companies had difficulties and then to prop it up and nurse them back into health when they are in difficulty. Well, I think now the time has come to do that, even though it was not handled in the same way.
But what of these companies that have failed and the depositors are left with no solution?
We need to give them a solution. We cannot say there is no solution. The central bank is certainly not the guarantor of finance companies. That we must also appreciate. The central bank does not guarantee deposits, but at the same time the central bank must do whatever that is in its power to nurse them back as well. They can't just wash their hands off, and during our time we did not allow that to happen. So now once again we got to ensure that they are nursed back, and those that are having difficulties are nursed back. Otherwise there is what is known as a contagion effect in the banking and the financial sector. When one fails, there is generally a feeling that the others also would fail, and that's a bad feeling to have. So we shouldn't allow people, depositors, lenders, anyone to get that feeling. So when the central bank comes out strongly and makes statements and say, no, we are going to rescue this, we are going to do this and A, B and C, and then people get confidence. That's how you deal with it. So hopefully we can use the funds as well, and at the same time find new investors, support them and get it back into shape as quickly as possible.
We have a lot of financial institutions at the same time in this economy, a small economy, but we have from development banks to some banks. I mean, do we require that kind of, such a number of institutions to be present in an economy as small as this?
In 2012, we did a survey. We did a study, and then we decided that we need to have lesser number of finance companies, and we came up with a very workable but ambitious plan of consolidation. And we articulated that. There was support, the government supported that, and we started that off. 2013 and 2014 were years when this consolidation process was taking shape. In 2015, it would have finished. Unfortunately, the government changed, and then the regime at the central bank also changed. They did not see that as a priority. In fact, they stopped it deliberately. Some say that they felt that it was Cabraal's plan and therefore they wanted to change it. It was never my plan. It was always a plan that was collectively done, and we wanted to do that for the stability, greater stability of the financial system. But for whatever reason, let's not worry about that, they stopped it. Now they are reaping the results of that change in policy, because by this time, by 2020, most probably we would have had about 10 large-scale finance companies, strong, with partnerships going with sometimes with banks, and that would have been a very strong financial sector. But that was not to be. The entire process of consolidation was stopped, and now we are facing the consequences of that. And now there's nobody responsible. Who stopped it? Why did they stop it? What was the basis on which it was stopped? So questions that need to be asked. But I don't think we need to waste time in going into that too much in detail. Right. We need to now look at the current conditions. We have a new patient, and this patient is, as you quite rightly said, in a difficult situation. So we need to rescue the patient, get him back from the operating theatre back into the normal ward, and then from the normal ward outside. And that's going to be a bit of a challenge, but if we approach it with the right frame of mind, I think we can do that.
Yes, I remember you talking about a few ways of resurrecting the economy that was already in hospital back in the day. This was before the election, but let's take a short break before we speak more with you, Mr. Cabraal. Do stay with us here at Hyde Park. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park, and we thought of talking during the last few minutes, Mr. Cabraal, about the global economy and how Sri Lanka will be placed, because we know there's a massive interest in Sri Lanka, a small island, but since decades, since centuries in history has shown that all these superpowers have had some or large interest in Sri Lanka. With the US Fed looking at reducing interest rates, the global economy looking at better times, and China, the United States, the trade war easing, it seems that Sri Lanka will have a new role to play too. But how are we looking at this in your understanding? The president in his manifesto during campaigning said he'll look at a people-centric economy. But with all these superpowers also wanting a piece of Sri Lanka, how are we looking at this?
Well, it's a challenge. We got to understand it in that context. Now, that's why sometimes we need to look at ourselves first. We have to put Sri Lanka first. Well, lots of things are happening in the rest of the world, but at the same time, if we get our priorities right as far as Sri Lankans are concerned, then we will be not getting into too much difficulty. So the fundamentals are, when we go out into the world, we got to give advantages to our own businessmen. Anywhere in the world they do that. If the Americans go to some other country, they will want to make sure that the American businessmen are given opportunities in those countries. When we meet with ambassadors who come from outside and who are in Sri Lanka, the most important thing that they talk to us about is their own businessmen who are here. And they want them to have advantages, they want them to have certain facilities, they want them to have certain types of concessions given. So they work for that, and that's important. That's a message that we must take positively. Right. So if Sri Lanka wants to do well outside in the world, we got to give our support to our own industries, to our own businessmen to go out there and work. Now, to do that, we have to strengthen them. We have to make sure that they have the ability to go out. We have to make sure that they have proper fundamentals here that they can reach out to. And that's also tough, because when they go out into the world, it's a very difficult world out there. As you quite rightly said, interest rates can come down in the US. China and US having a trade pact coming through can be good for us, can also be bad for us. Now, these are all factors that we got to take into consideration very carefully. So when we plan out our economic model, as well as what we are going to do for the future, we got to be conscious of all that is what is happening in the world. So if we keep in mind that what is most strategic as far as we are concerned is to see that our business people are provided with the space for them to do their work well. For that, the country has to have the space. So if we have high growth, even if there is some turmoil in the world and then we see that growth is suffering, we won't impact our country too badly. If we are having inflation which is low, even if there are some global conditions that make prices go up, even if the prices go up a little bit, we are still within the boundaries that can be tolerable. If we have interest rates which are low, even if there is some turmoil and that is causing interest rates to rise, like what you were just mentioning, when US does well, the interest rates can sometimes go up, sometimes can go down. Then when it goes down, most of the money shifts across to those havens, which means that there's less money coming in to us. So then we may have to pay higher interest rates. So if our interest rates are already low, then we have space there. If our rupee is strong, even if there's a little turmoil here and there once in a way, we can suffer through that. So that's why it's very important that we have spaces, that we have buffers in our economy that will give us the space to have a shock. Because shocks will come. You can be sure of that. There is no question that shocks won't come. During the time that I was governor, we went through oil prices shock which took oil prices up to $145 per barrel. We had the global recession. We had banks collapsing every day. We had food crisis. I don't think anybody in Sri Lanka knew there was a food crisis. Then we had a war here. We dealt with the war also. But nobody said that we are at war. We dealt with the economy with the right conditions so that people could go about their normal business. Now that is the type of management that we need to put in place now, once again, because we will see lots of stresses coming from the rest of the world as well.
You talk about economic policies, the right economic policies in place back in the day during all those challenges that the country was simultaneously going through. But recently the President mentioned that we will veer away from neoliberalism, neoliberal policies that have been practiced in the country. We will not have Western ideology brought into the country. But he did mention about an alternative economic model. But what is this alternative model? Are we looking at something we saw back in the day when the same parties were in power, or is this an alternative model that we're new to?
I like what the President said, that he wants to have an economic policy that is people-centric. Now that's very easy for people to understand. I think anyone on the street, if you say what is people-centric, the person, the man, the woman, the child is the center of economic activity. So if we think of that person and then prepare the model for that. But if you say alternative, if you say neoliberalism, I don't think anybody in this country understands. I was never too hot on these descriptions.
What was the economic
model that we had was whether it works for Sri Lanka, whether it is right for Sri Lanka. And then you do what is right for Sri Lanka. Sometimes it may have a origin in Africa, it may have origin in the US, it may have origin elsewhere. But it doesn't matter for us. If we feel that this is the right policy for Sri Lanka, we used to apply that. And then we worked on those lines. So we were not trapped in a situation where we had to say, okay, this is the policy, and therefore according to this policy we do that. No. We did what is best for Sri Lanka, and we must always remember that there is a time and space. The time and space for Sri Lanka is in Sri Lanka. The time, sometimes when let's say the US, when they had a $4,000 per capita income, could have been 30 years ago, when they had an economy that was $4,000 per capita. So today, if you try to borrow a policy from the US when it's having a $50,000 per capita income, I'm just giving an example, that may not work here. One day someone asked me this question. I said, if you take the governor of the US, when the US was having a $4,000 per capita income, you search as to what he had done at that time, then ask me the question. Because we were having $4,000 or near to that at that time. Because these are time, this is the space. So you got to understand it in that context. So if somebody says it happened there and then we should do it here, I'm not in agreement.
I wish I could speak more to you about this. We have about 1.5 minutes, Mr. Cabraal. I would call the economic policy back in the day, whatever works for Sri Lanka. No alternative policy, no neoliberalism. But what are the urgent areas that you're advising the Prime Minister and the government to look at now in the short term? Because whatever policies we take now will be reflected in the medium to long run.
We have a very ambitious program going forward for the country. That is very important, that we have a long-term vision for the country, and that is articulated very clearly in President Gotabaya's manifesto. But at the same time, we have to kickstart the economy. All that depends on the economy having a driving force, and that is important for us to also reflect upon. Now, everything that needs to be done won't happen unless you have a robust economy. So right now, in my view, the priority is to get the economic activity back again on track. Back again, the economy has to be kick-started. People must feel good. People must feel, well, this government knows what to do. We will support it. We will also go ahead with it. People must start investing. Locals must invest. The foreigners must invest. There must be robust activity in the country. We may need to create that. Once that is created, the rest of it will follow. Now we have a very clear plan, what President Gotabaya has put out as his manifesto. We can follow that and work towards that, provided we have the right building blocks put in place. And that's the challenge right now, and we need to do that fast.
And I wish you all the very best to overcome those challenges and in all your efforts to advise the present regime.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We had with us Mr. Ajith Nivard Cabraal, former Central Bank Governor of Sri Lanka, now Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister on Economic Affairs, and of course the author of the expose, The Mother of All Cover-Ups. We'll see you again with yet another program at Hyde Park at the same time, same place. Have a pleasant evening and all the very best for the new year. මේකත් දාන්නකො මම